years. 4 straight years.
We just had a child who was murdered in the classroom.
Anyone who denies that crime is going down consistently in New York City is denigrating the hard work of the men and women of the NYPD.
Good evening and welcome to MetroFocus. I'm Jenna Flanagan. Sparks flew at last night's mayoral debate as the 3 candidates, Republican Nicole Malliotakis, Independent Bo Dietl, and incumbent Democratic Mayor Bill de Blasio met on stage, and civility almost immediately went out the window.
Not my job, not my job. That's what he does all the time. It is his job.
Mayor de Blasio came under attack from both sides as he was frequently booed by the crowd. Both Malliotakis and Dietl took loud and pointed shots at the mayor, oftentimes yelling into their mics to be heard over the raucous crowd. One person even had to be escorted out.
Good night, sir.
Joining us now to tell us what we can take away from the debate and if it's an indication of what we can expect in the next one is WNYC City Hall reporter Brigid Bergin. Brigid, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
I've been reading Twitter this morning, and a lot of the words that I've been seeing to describe the debate were raucous, sometimes street. Some people even use the word ratchet. How would you describe the debate?
Well, I actually watched it from here at the station because we did a post-game analysis right afterwards. And I can say as a television viewer, all that rowdiness came right through. You could hear the crowd just practically yelling over some of the candidates. They were shouting down the mayor, they were cheering for Bo Dietl or Assemblywoman Malliotakis. At one point, the moderator, Errol Lewis, had to actually eject someone from the audience from the auditorium, which he did on live television, so we all heard it. So I think all of the campaigns definitely came prepared with supporters to fill that room and to try and make an impression on viewers and the journalists in that room.
Well, would you say that there was anybody who came more prepared? Because it seemed to me also as a viewer that every single time Mayor de Blasio tried to open his mouth, he was shouted down, booed down, etc. So who do you think brought the larger cheering crowd?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to say. As a television viewer, you heard the audience interrupting consistently. I think if the question is who is prepared to talk about policy during this debate, the answer is pretty simple, and it was fairly clear. Certainly 4 years of experience prepared the mayor to have some really substantive policy conversations around things that he's accomplished and things he intends to try and do in the next 4 years. I think Assemblywoman Malliotakis offered some pretty sharp criticism. She presented some alternative policies, certainly her opposition to closing Rikers and, her position that the money that the city is planning for that 10-year closure plan should be used instead to refurbish the existing facilities and to try and bring some order and some, support there is a clear difference from Mayor de Blasio. However, I think, there were a lot of other issues where things got a little mushier. And then when you consider the other candidate on the stage, Independent Bo Dietl, he was, as he has been throughout the campaign, pretty off the wall. In a question about how to deal with the segregation of the city's schools, the only real policy he suggested was to ban cell phones.
First things I would do is ban the damn cell phones from the classroom. Let kids learn. That's our big problem out here.
I'm not sure how that addresses segregation in schools, but it was part of kind of his ongoing style of kind of ranting his answers as opposed to really having a deliberative discussion with the other candidates.
Were there any of the debate topics that stood out most to you? When I was watching, one of the things that I noticed was the mayor seemed to be the most on the ropes when he was questioned about the MTA. He then used that chance to sort of reassert the fact that as mayor of New York City, he's not in charge of the MTA, the governor is. But that didn't seem to sit too well with everyone who was on stage.
Yes, I think at one point the independent candidate, Bo Dietl, quote, declared that the mayor was saying it was not his job and that it was in fact his job. I think that is an issue that the mayor is still trying to figure out how to deal with. He has a very clear plan, and his proposal for how to address the problem is this millionaire's tax. That proposal is something that he thinks would provide the long-term funding solution to deal with the MTA's problems. At the same time, we know that that's something that would have to go through the state legislature. He's encountered many obstacles when he's come up with proposals that require the state legislature to support them, and also the governor. On the flip side of that, Assemblywoman Malliotakis said that she would commit to working with the governor to find a solution to deal with these transit issues. If a Democratic mayor can't work with a Democratic governor, I'm not sure how well a Republican mayor could work with the Democratic governor to solve those problems. I'm sure Mayor Bloomberg would have some thoughts on that. But it's clearly an issue that the candidates know voters want them to address. In terms of substantive solutions, I think we still have a long way to go.
Was there anything really important that you think was left out or didn't get the time and gravitas that it should have?
There was some conversation around issues of police and community, and certainly the mayor talked a lot about what his administration has done to improve those relationships. There wasn't a lot of conversation about what that's going to look like in the next 4 years. There wasn't a lot of conversation, around a lot of the future plans that, either Assemblywoman Malliotakis or independent candidate Dietl had as alternatives to what another 4 years of Bill de Blasio would look like. When they tried to have a conversation about affordability, it was sort of this sprawling discussion that went from, a bit of a criticism of the mayor's affordable housing plan, saying that it wasn't affordable enough, which is actually a criticism that often comes from challengers to his left, and that was coming from Republican Assemblywoman Malliotakis. And yet, when pressed for what her alternatives would be, she didn't offer a lot in a way of concrete solutions for that problem, other than saying that people needed good-paying jobs, living wages. That's something that the mayor has also said.
Yeah, and those have been talking points that we've heard numerous times from both sides of the aisle. After this debate, do you feel as though there's a particular candidate who will be better prepared for the next one to present their case to New Yorkers, perhaps in a louder fashion, in a more direct fashion, for the next debate?
Well, I don't think it could get a lot louder than it did last night. I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not the next debate is the leading contenders debate. There's a real question about whether or not independent candidate Dietl will be a participant in that debate. And it could end up being just a head-to-head between Mayor de Blasio and Assemblywoman Malliotakis. I think if that's the case, we're going to hear a little bit more of the substance and a little bit less of the circus. In that, I think it's important for Assemblywoman Malliotakis to be prepared with those policy alternatives, because we know the mayor has 4 years under his belt. He has lots to talk about, whether it's what he's already done and some of what he's planning to do.
Seems as if with everything in politics nowadays, there were 3 candidates who were on stage, but there was a 4th politician who was very much in the room, but not necessarily part of the debate. Can you tell us a little bit about who everyone was talking about and not talking about?
It was very clear that one of the strategies Mayor de Blasio was trying to deploy was to do his best to tie Assemblywoman Malliotakis and independent candidate Dietl to President Trump. Both of the candidates said that they voted for President Trump, and at one point, when there was an opportunity for the candidates to ask each other questions, Mayor de Blasio asked Assemblywoman Malliotakis, why she voted for President Trump. Did she actually think that President Trump would be a better president than Hillary Clinton? And that has been an issue that has really dogged her on the campaign trail in a very blue New York City. She has tried to say that this is an election about New York City, that we shouldn't be talking about the 2016 campaign. And yet I think there are still real questions about, if she were mayor, what would the city's policy be in relationship to the federal government? And I think that's part of why that issue keeps coming up.
All right, well, politics in New York are never boring.
Never boring.
All right, well, listen, Brigid Bergin, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.